During the peak of the coronavirus epidemic or pandemic, AstraZeneca, a company, used language generating AI to synthesize data from millions or thousands of medical reports from across the globe so that it could have the information to make the vaccine that is helping the world today. We are very proud to propose this motion, not just because AstraZeneca produced a vaccine, but we also believe stringently at OG that if AI was running WUDC tabs, we would probably run this tournament on time. In terms of framing, three key things you need to understand and what the comparative is on what they need to defend. Firstly, AI is quicker than human beings, so it will do stuff quickly. Secondly, it has the ability to synthesize information from large data sets. Human beings have cognitive limitations, which means that you will never be able to synthesize this much information. Thirdly, we obviously develop AI better and stronger on our side of the house and also gets to the spin-off technological benefits. But lastly, I want to crucially assert this. We have human control over output. That is to say that if Guardian was going to publish an article written by AI, it probably wouldn't, if it was extremely racist, extremely sexist, there is still some degree of human control over the output that is published. What is the comparative that opposition needs to defend in this round? Firstly, they need to defend human beings taking control. That is to say that one, their processes on their side have to be slower, have to be cognitively limited. And thirdly, they have to be laden with a lack of accountability, because oftentimes we as human beings place trust on other human beings better as opposed to a black box. And we say, what the fuck is this black box? Is this even doing the right thing? I'll talk more about accountability later on. Three arguments in this speech. One, why we have innovation in organizational performance. Secondly, why we get technological benefits that are crucial on our side. Thirdly, I'm going to talk about accountability, both human and for technology. Let's talk about innovation and organizational performance. I want to note very, very minimally, what does AI help call centers, customer support, all of these sorts of service businesses do? One, it reduces your cost because you're able to communicate more effectively and you don't need that many people. Secondly, it just means that this translates into cheaper products for people on the ground. Thirdly, it opens up opportunities for business growth because you're able to make more profit, but you're also able to save on costs. Again, this means more jobs for people on the ground, etc., etc. This is clear. But secondly, I want you to note that there's also a very big research benefit that we get on our side of the house. What is the problem with research being conducted by consultancies, but even like academics right now? There are couple of things that people do. One, there's a bias towards groupthink, right? Like we always think about things in groups where we're in a specific era, we want research to go in a specific direction if we're in an organization. There are status quo biases where you want to do stuff that is important in the status quo. There's a repetition bias that you want to do things that are already popular. There are availability heuristics where if you don't have access to information, you will not be able to do things better. There are short-term biases where companies want to focus only on the limited stuff, not on broad stuff like that this AI will be able to do. And lastly, there's limited cognitive capacity of researchers. We get better research on our side of the house because this AI is able to do it quickly. Large data sets, again, there's no bias towards short-termism. There's a long-termism argument over here as well. So it creates reports and then we're able to see better or what report matters and how much it matters. So we have research innovation that is not damaged by such biases. The impact of this argument is, one, businesses get new ideas, for instance, new ideas that can radically improve and change the lives of people on the ground. We think that this is very important. Research becomes much better. Government's capacity to engage in policy making becomes much better when they're having reports written by AI and reading reports written by AI on our side of the house. Before moving on to the second argument, CEO, quickly.
Do you think that there is a differential in the ways that people perceive information when it is written using different phrases and terms that government might want to affect the ways in which people perceive something like public health information?
Fantastic. I'll actually talk about that in accountability, so I'll get down to that POI later on. Okay, secondly, let's talk about technological benefits really, really quickly. I want to note three mechanisms over here for why we get better technology on our side of the house. Firstly, because of the rise, more money is being put into this AI, therefore more research is being conducted, and therefore we have it faster on our side of the house as opposed to their side of the house. The second thing I want to note is that more jobs are opening up. This means companies are hiring more people, but also students are incentivized to go into universities to pursue AI degrees, etc., and because this field pays. Lastly, there is more competition because more companies are entering the market and therefore checking this AI, but also producing better AI. What is the impact of this? One, I think the AI gets better itself, therefore your benefits scale as you go into the long run. But secondly, I want to note that there are certain narrow AI fields that we don't put lots of money into, that we get lots of money into on our side of the house. Why? Because, and this looks like medical technology AI, nanotech AI, which aren't sexy issues on the face of it, but they face lots of pushback from people. Why do they face pushback? Because in the status status quo, AI is looked at as this, Terminator regime coming in. There's lots of scaremongering. It's framed as an existential threat. So there isn't a lot of capacity or willingness to invest in this. One, I want to note that on our side of the house, not only are more people entering the AI field, therefore more AI fields are going to get better, but AI learns from AI, and therefore you get better AI in the future and more diverse AI. But lastly, think of this. Your Gmail sentences, your Outlook sentences are completed by AI, or your consultancies, your businesses, every single organization is likely to use this AI to cut down their costs. Human interaction with peaceful AI, as this is framed, increase manifestly on our side of the house, and therefore people are better able to understand the benefits of AI and not look at it as an existential threat, which means that AI on the whole gets better and we get much more research and money on our side of the house. Technological benefits stand on our side. Lastly, on accountability, answering this POI, the first thing I want to note is AI won't go batshit crazy because there are social standards and therefore you're still willing to check this. Secondly, I want to note that there is competition happening because of the mechanism I told you earlier. So companies are going to check the AI produced by other companies and therefore probably produce better AI in the long run. But thirdly, why do we get better interaction from human beings? One, I've already told you, human beings are interacting this on a mass scale on our side of the house. People are already using this AI. Facebook uses it, Gmail uses it, Outlook uses it. So they're better able to trust it at the point at which they see it as, personally beneficial to them and so on. But what is the problem in the status quo with human accountability? I want to note that there's a lot of online racist abuse, sexist abuse, or lots of sexism, etc., in the status quo, especially on the internet. And this, does the Euros final just tells you how much Sancho, etc., did it. What's the problem right now? Oftentimes, right wingers or people on the ground, centrists who don't have access to this information say, aha, this is not a huge issue. Online abuse is just like this small minority that might be loud. It's not that big. When AI starts collecting this data and it actually shows up in the sentences and the reports that it is publishing, it becomes very difficult for governments, people to say this is not an issue. We can use this as a heuristic for policy to see how much progress our anti-racist, our anti-sexist policies or anti-homophobic policies have done. So this is a key data heuristic that we have. Lastly, I want to note that people oftentimes don't know, on their side of the house, AI is still going to be produced in different fields, but people will never be able to hold it to account because it's a black box. Engineers or backroom boardrooms will make deals that people will never understand this. We have better understanding on our side of the house at the point at which interactions, etc., increase and people see this as a useful tool. For all these reasons, very proud to propose.
In government as they sing the praises of AI without any consideration of who is going to have access to this technology, what it's going to be used for, and how sheerly manipulative it is going to be. So there's going to be 4 claims from opening opposition. 1, an analysis of why it is only a select few who gets control of this technology. 2, the fundamental access on human agency that this represents. 3, how this reinforces bias and prevents accountability. 4, the large-scale unemployment in the wider economy you're going to get as a result. But before that, just a clarification on the comparative. I think the comparative on OO is fairly straightforward. It's simply that we don't have this large-scale development of AI that has language generation capabilities. This looks like, for example, scientists deciding that this is not worth it and just not doing this. I think that's what the motion means. The rebuttal is going to be integrated. The first claim that we have from opening opposition is analysis of who gets control. And we think it is specifically only the very largest and richest companies and large governments that are going to get control. This also, we'll see how this responds to OG's claims in a moment. I think there are 5 reasons for this. The first is that language generation is a very difficult task that requires massive data sets beyond what is needed for something like chess, for example. In many cases, these data sets come from, for example, Google's ability to record all of your emails. That's why they provide you Google Drive for free. And this is something that is essential to their business operations and therefore is not going to be available for other companies. The second is that it requires a high level of expertise in order to make this, to develop this technology. There are very few people with this level of expertise because they need experience working on these projects, and not very many of them happen in the first place. The third is a degree of technology that's required because of the high degree of processing that's necessary in order for this to be effective. Note that under the status quo, even the best versions are somewhat error prone. So going into the future, for this to be the most effective, you need very high processing power. That means having access to the very best microchips in the world with the highest number of capacitors, so your algorithm is actually able to learn to those very high standards. I would note that often this hardware is considered a national security issue, and therefore countries just don't allow it to be randomly exported to other places. Fourthly, insofar that companies have developed this technology, it gives them a market edge on other companies, and therefore they're not going to just sell it off to other companies, because that means that they lose that market advantage. And fifthly, empirically, we see it is literally your Googles and Amazons and Apples of the world that have things like voice recognition in the present day in the development of these technologies. Why is this significant? I think this means that all of the benefits that open government wants to talk about economically are concentrated in these very large companies and governments. There's two reasons why this is significant. The first is we literally don't care if these rich companies get any more richer than they are under the status quo. We think the average, they're already very well off. I don't know why we need to make them even better off. But secondly, oftentimes these companies use their influence and money for evil things. Companies lobby and lobby the government in order to make them less regulated. They use this technology to monopolize markets so others can't enter. But in many cases, these actively evil actors. In the case of the Chinese and Russian governments, they already have entire propaganda departments used to spread misinformation overseas. I think giving them the ability to have the most effective writing generated by artificial intelligence is only going to strengthen that ability. Second claim then on the assault on human agency that this represents. OG says this technology is really good. The thing they don't recognize is how manipulative this is going to be in terms of humans. I think this is going to be so much worse than your human salesman trying to sell something to you for a couple of reasons. One, much more access to just global information. It can search the entirety of the web in a second. It can synthesize that, as OG says. Secondly, it's able to spot trends that humans don't notice on their everyday level because it has access to all of that. Thirdly, it has much more information on you specifically. It's able to track your clicks. It's able to track who you've liked on Facebook and synthesize that information. Facebook has already been able to predict what you're going to like better than your closest family members with as few as 50 likes that you have. I think this gets so much worse. But fourthly, it is literally the creation of language itself. So instead of relying on humans who write persuasively based on what they perceive to be persuasive, you now have a technology that is able to create text on its own, synthesizing all of the knowledge that it has around the world globally in seconds of what is going to be the most manipulative to you. And fifthly, because it's indistinguishable, you're not going to notice it either. Why is this so critically important to this debate? One, we show you that that technology is going to be incredibly manipulative in the things that it is preventing. And I think human agency is fundamental to this debate, because without human agency, when you're being manipulated to make choices in a certain way or not, you're not truly free. Without freedom, none of this higher economic standards of living or whatever stuff makes sense, because you have no ability to choose what matters to you and to be a human being and live a life like that. Thirdly, then, in terms of bias and accountability, I think there's just four reasons why bias and accountability gets so much worse on the government side. The first is that these technologies inherently draw on existing biases that exist under status quo, and because they recognize patterns and extrapolate those patterns going into the future, they literally amplify those biases. That's why even the best police software with the highest degree of awareness and liberalism and whatever, and even places like San Francisco, still overwhelmingly direct police officers into areas like black neighborhoods, for example, to fight crime, etc. Secondly, and so far that this actively gives this technology the ability to write writing itself, it is able to create a degree of writing that is more manipulative than any human being is able to create, and therefore it amplifies these biases in those ways. Thirdly, I think this kind of technologies is often held in very high regard and seen as neutral. For example, in the justice system, when places have introduced things like automated sentencing, judges just trust that without questioning, even though it has mistakes and has been shown to be worse. Fourthly, it is unnoticeable, and therefore you don't get the same level of accountability. I think the importance of this is this makes this technology actively harmful towards reinforcing human biases and makes it harder to hold them accountable, because now they're so much more articulate than your racist Fox News commentator or whatever who you can call out really easily. Before I move on, CG.
Given that it's still an autonomous decision to buy things, isn't the absolute worst harm of your second contention just that people get shown things more often that they really want to buy? It doesn't force you to purchase something, it just gives you more access to options that are better tailored for your desires.
I think the scope of this debate goes far beyond what you are buying. It is the news that you read, it is the political opinions that you hold that are now like under the control of evil foreign actors like China and Russia who have every incentive to manipulate you and destabilize your country. I think that's horrible. Fourthly, on the wider economy and the large-scale unemployment that results from this, OG sings the praises of like, oh, economic benefits. I think that insofar that this technology is massively better than humans for the reasons that we've already analyzed, you get two things. One is massive job losses around the world. Why is this the case? There are so many human jobs nowadays that depend on writing, like when you're the writing of prose, the analysis of prose, and those sorts of things. News reporters, teachers, scientists, etc., all have this as like a core part of their jobs and things like what they're delivering. Secondly, I think there's no replacement job in these cases because the opening government's probably going to say something like automation, we move to the service industry or whatever. But like we are literally already in the service sector, and humans are providing these services of writing, etc., for other people. When that's taken away, I literally don't know what humans are being to. Because writing, and that is such a fundamental part of the economy, I think there's massive damage to that, and that undermines unemployment and destabilizes society and harms all of the ordinary people that we care about on opening opposition. Very proud to oppose.
Symmetric claims from opening opposition. A, tech corporations are evil. Sure, they'll be evil some other way. In fact, the algorithms they mention have nothing to do with language generating AI. So I was a bit confused by their Facebook, Twitter claim. Two, this will lead to mass employment. Literally mass unemployment. Literally true for all technological development ever. Three, we're putting money in the coffers of Silicon Valley. Literally true for all technological development ever. What they've done here in opening opposition and screwed over closing opposition with is run a stock we are against anti-AI case without giving us any nuanced reasons why specifically language generating AI, not people who use historical data arrest records in California and a police station, but specifically language generating AI is problematic. I'm going to take out their claims in two different ways. Firstly, I'm going to look at the claim from bias. The first thing I want to point out here is that we completely agree that this AI will use structural association. So if the N word has been used in association with Black people a lot and the AI churns out an article, we want to see it because human beings currently have social desirability bias. They don't see it except in the locker room. However, when the AI publishes these things, we know, oh no, so when we synthesize all of the metadata across Facebook, this is what the AI has come up with. Taha literally said this is a barometer for sexual, racial, and minority progress, the point at which you bring it out into the open, so that frames out all of their bias claims. But secondly, they missed this flip side of the coin that you have cognitive biases, availability heuristics, status quo bias, short-termist bias. All of these things stay within their world, and these aren't social biases. These are cognitive biases. These are limitations that we have because we were in trees 200,000 years ago, which means that we have much more rapid technological development on our side because these are biases that don't exist on our side. Our AI is not embarrassed to say whatever it wants to, and our AI is also significantly quicker. The second way I want to deal with their claim is vis-a-vis our argument about accountability, which went completely unresponded to. Currently, when historical data arrest records use AI technology, what happens right now, such as OpenAI is a good example of this, what happens right now is just a machine with beeps and buttons. No one understands it. But right now, you can scale how good the AI is getting by reading an article in the
The Guardian, there's an understanding problem, as CEO very validly pointed out. What we want is that 10 years from now, when this AI publishes a perfectly timed New York Times article, our response will be, what the fuck? AI is going really, really far. But we don't have that heuristic right now because we have an anthropomorphic bias, right? If I see a smart human being, I think they're smart. But if I think they're smart because they wrote a lot of math equations, I don't know what that means, right? So I need to understand them in a language that makes sense to me. We create the language of accountability because language generating AI will be smart by doing things that we think are smart. So by definition, we get AI accountability on our side because we can check how powerful it is getting from step to step to step. I think that's extremely crucial in this debate. But finally, the way I want to rebut them and also take out the PI from CEO is just a new claim. This will be completely co-opted by bad actors. Sorry, CG, I'm running the China extension here, where the point at which you hamper development, this is not going to happen in countries which do not have the regulatory mechanisms or honestly the regulatory incentives to care about this policy. What they're going to do is rapidly develop this AI for the exact fears that opening opposition and closing opposition pointed out. This is going to be using it for propagandistic purposes. Is going to be to manipulate the people. Because you know what? We can shit on America because we're in debating, but I would take them every single day of the week over an authoritarian state, which is only intention is to manipulate people and to enslave and coerce people. What that means then is that when you drop the ball and say, we're not going to develop AI, every single bad actor which does not listen to these policies is going to develop that AI, and we compound all of the harms that opening opposition has mentioned about manipulation, about coercion, about control. Before I move on then towards talking about how we get much better policy, much better research, I'm really happy to take closing opposition. Go ahead.
Do you think that people lack the ability to understand that society is racist if they don't see the N-word being published?
No, they do, and I'll tell you why, because none of us were at Yale or LSE, so most people don't understand structural racism and structural sexism, so we sort of have to explain it to them. You know, half of them have voted for Trump, they clearly don't. But secondarily, the point at which you do have language generating AI come out and then just say literally the statistical association between the N-word and black people is significantly high, that's very different from a racist white person sounding off on Telegram, sounding off on 8chan, but never saying it out in the open. It's only when the AI uses that metadata to create the statistical association that you say our society is openly racist, but in a closeted fashion. I want to talk about firstly how we improve performances of organizations significantly. Before that, one last claim standing from opening opposition: access. They won't be able to access this technology. Firstly, I want to intuition pump this. When Deep Blue beat Garry Kasparov in 1998 in a chess game, literally 5 years later, everyone had a system AI running on their computers. Like, these technologies do democratize because one company creates it, then it's reverse engineered by other companies. And in Pakistan, we can buy it for like 60 fucking rupees. What that happens then is that over the last 20 years, the market mechanisms create incentives for you to lower prices for the same company. But secondarily speaking, everyone creates its pirated versions of these technologies, which means we do get access. Finally, let's talk about performance then. The first thing I want to point out here is capacity. As Taha said to you, AstraZeneca was literally using LG AI in order to synthesize millions of reports being published on RDVX of about medical reports about Corona in Wuhan, Corona on the Diamond Princess, all of that stuff. You can't do that in quick emergency urgent situations unless you have the capacity of AI. Note also my earlier responses about the several psychological biases that we have that AI neatly sidesteps. Finally, we also have a human person at the end of it, right? Which is a claim that they're missing. So the AI generates some outrageous claim like, you know what, we're going to do X, Y, and Z, which will lead to 10 people dying. We're obviously going to say no AI, that's wrong for two reasons. One, as Taha shows to you, there's deep-seated skepticism in the public of AI. So this black box argument that all the debaters run never makes sense to me. Have you ever met a poor person in the Philippines or in Pakistan or anywhere? They're like, yeah, machines taking over everything. That's really cool. I trust it because it's a computer. Like, no one really thinks like that. People have inherent skepticism of technology in the poor world. And in the rich world, they read the New York Times, for God's sake. There's an inherent left-wing argument against AI insofar as most of the research that's published of AI is the stuff that opening opposition was saying. Historical data, arrest records, Facebook manipulating our elections. Our news cycle is dominated by how AI is negative and is toxifying our political cycle and our policy cycle. What that means then is that we get policies within the frame of accountability, which I think is really important. Three ways in which this happens. One, I've already showed you that it's very rapid. But two, innovation occurs in our world. This also takes out the mass employment point for two reasons. One, when you're coming up with new ideas and new companies, then by definition, you're going to create new markets, right? That's by definition true, and also new workforces. But secondly, and much more importantly, by the time that you're researching, you also research how to best come up with a good universal basic income, how to deal with the poor, how to expand the welfare state. Our policy cycle gets much better, and we deal with the unemployment and the disenfranchised within our world much better because you're not constrained by cognitive cognitive biases. Panel, this is a great idea. Don't let them win on a stock anti-AI case. We're simply stupid. World is evidence of it. Let's give it off to AI. I am so proud to propose.
Three, two, one. I know that Octo finals are stressful, but I really wish that Hamza hadn't tried to run a rebuttal to our case, which was simply that we had missed the debate, and had listened to the nuanced analysis that Andrew gave you as to why specifically all of the computational advantages that the PM identified are why this technology will uniquely be able to think about things like trends in persuasion and influence in a way greater than the perfect orator or even the shitty tech we have now, the way in which we think, the way in which we perceive information, and the information which is presented in front of us. Given that this is an impact which is still standing because that analysis was not taken down, and given that this affects every single one of us, as well as things like the stability of our democratic systems and the concentration of wealth within our economic systems reaching a tipping point, I think just on a scale of impact, we win this debate. The first thing I'm going to do in this speech is to go through the mechanisms that you heard from opening government and to explain either why they're just false or we outweigh them. Then I'm going to explain why our inaccessibility of tech argument still stands, what the impacts of this are, and then finally how you should just weigh this against any contribution, including marginal closing contributions in this debate. Firstly, what did we hear about innovation from opening government? The first was that you get greater profits as firms and that lowers costs for businesses, and there is some sort of link which was not mechanized that leads to more jobs for individuals. The first thing I would say is the delta for these kind of economic benefits in terms of like processing of information and productivity per worker are quite minimal. The reason that this matters is because the only reason you hire more workers is if productivity of workers goes up so that their cost is lower than their productivity. I think we already have things like copying and pasting and various mechanisms that make workers themselves more efficient. This is therefore uniquely a debate about the ability of this AI to create languages and to create wholesale output which replaces those workers. But notice how even if they were right about this more jobs, this doesn't stand up to our arguments about monopolization, about the fact that the biggest corporations are now at a more greater rate able to create new innovations in their best case scenario and then patent and lock those things away. Now we get it. They already buy up infant companies now. They already monopolize the space. But the comparative on our side is at least small scale investors, at least small scale inventors get some money and the economic system flows to some extent in terms of transfers of wealth. Now they literally have the tool to be able to create that innovation and lock it away so that you buy their current shitty iPhone. This is just such a big impact in this debate insofar as it is the current status quo biggest problem of our age on steroids, and it uniquely occurs because this AI has the ability to process language and to process scientific advancements in the way that they describe. This is far more important than their current based stuff about AstraZeneca, which by the way is an example they don't even explain why it's relevant, but more importantly falls at the point that they themselves concede that the current issue under the status quo is there is a terminator negative bias perception against AI. We think they make this far worse by abandoning the mechanisms they talk about, which they claim are burdensome, like slower human control. Because what slower human control looks like is like the head chief medical officer of your country literally sitting down the idiots of your country and telling them why the vaccine is good, how they have come to conclusions, and all of these various things. Yes, they are slow, but we think that the ability to know that it was a random guy who went to a university I know who did all of the research versus a machine that I'm putting my life in when I take the vaccine is sometimes the tipping point. So it's unclear why this is a big point in the debate. The second thing they say is that we get groupthink repetition bias bias and short-termism, because researchers and firms want quick short-term benefits. I want to note the OG solution to this is literally to compile billions of peer-reviewed articles into a machine, which they admit replicates the output of what those previous inputs were. So if there was groupthink and repetition bias, which led to the direction of research for things like research articles, if it is true, as they say, that there is going to be ultimate human control at the end stage, then the same mechanisms that they talk about apply on their side, because the nature of research is led on their side. The outcomes are still led by those mechanisms on their side of the house. Now, I guess in their best case, they can say, oh, no, because we just let the machine run, and then whatever happens at the end, we like, oh, this is a new innovation. That's obviously not true, because it's bound by the millions of articles which came before it. What is the comparative on our side of the house? Because we recognize that things like groupthink and repetition bias and all of these things exist on our side, but we think that scientists, especially top scientists, tend to be arrogant fucks at the end of the day, and we think that often they know of stories of people who have like done groundbreaking things, who initially received criticism, like Newton or Darwin or whatever, and they can cement their name in history in the long term by breaking the mold and by being disliked for a while. So the comparative is we have a small number of arrogant people who lead to innovation on our side versus on their side. And firstly, the machines literally being bound by the biased research before them, but secondly, that research being monopolized by the actors we talked about in the first place. The final thing then is on human accountability. Their biggest response to our stuff on this is to say, when the AI is racist, we will know what, we'll basically know, oh my gosh, society's reached a mad point because the N-word was said by the AI machine. The problem with this is it assumes that the subtle mechanisms of how these machines are able to learn and persuade are not used on their side of the house. Because if you believe what we say, that there are nefarious actors who control this technology, and that these machines are used to be able to find the most persuasive techniques and the ways of framing these words, then we think that that is going to be generally persuasive to the general population, and you're not going to get these massive societal discussions about how we've reached an awful point when the N-word is within that tweet. But more importantly, we think on the comparative, humans are way more accountable because it's a person you can see face to face. It's a person whose life you can cancel. Twitter mobs can at least work for that, but it can't work for a machine because they're behind closed doors and very few people understand them, or they're like, I don't know how you would say it, like the algorithms. Very quickly before I move on, opening government.
Okay, again, this is an internal contradiction. You can't both say that people manipulate people for bad outcomes, but also not persuade them of good outcomes, right? Like one of those things has to be true.
Yeah, I just don't think you have enough time to flesh out that point of information. The best that I can understand it is that we are saying that on our side of the house, there are nefarious actors who have the ability to subtly influence the way that people presented information because of the way that it is framed and the ability of that AI to learn. And that is a very separate point in terms of pros and the ability to persuade to the stuff that you guys were talking about, which is on technological innovation. I think there are two separate parts of that debate, and it's not a contradiction. Let's finally talk about an impact Andrew stuff on inaccessible technology. He gives you loads of reasons like large data sets and the best processing machinery, which explains why the actors that we were talking about are going to have the technology. This went unresponded to by Hamza. It exists in the debate. That means we're going to get things like the monopolization of innovation. We're going to get like things like Cambridge Analytica on steroids. Now, the deputy prime minister says, but China, I want to know this house supports a trend motion, and we were very clear what our comparative is, which is just that this doesn't really exist. It feigns out of existence. The technological curve doesn't tend upwards, it trends downwards. Why does this matter? Because it literally bounds your ability to make decisions and live in a democracy at the point that your information is bound. This isn't just a rhetorical trump. This isn't just Fox News. This is literally the next step. Shit is getting real now. We win on top half because OG didn't recognize that.
I'd like to thank the previous speaker.
Let's be smart on framing. 1, AI is coming no matter what. It has the ability to control us right now, and it will have a much greater ability to do so in the future. Already, we have AI that is able to direct our news feeds so that we see the particular information that it wants us to see. Already, we have AI that is able to create highly persuasive information, even if it doesn't rise much further. Already, we have AI that is able to control where we walk, where we go, that is able to find us in any place in China or any place in America. We have AI that is used to track us and surveil us on a large basis, mostly by major tech companies. That does not change either side of the house. The question is what we do with that AI. The thing that we need to say is that we need to develop responses to it. And we think that showing off language generating AI is a great way to create that response. So the second point of framing then is why we beat the entire top half, because the entire top half is effectively, OG says, there are very good things that AI can do. OO says there are very bad things that AI can do. Many of them are centered around things like convincing the public of XYZ thing or doing research on XYZ thing. But I also want to note that the possibility of generating strong general artificial intelligence, that is artificial intelligence that is able to perform a wide variety of tasks and has a general mandate rather than a very specific task, is hugely potentially damaging or beneficial to humankind. AI that can program itself to be better at basically whatever it wants to do, if it is not controlled properly, could effectively take over the world and could effectively destroy and devastate technological systems across the world, killing millions and millions of people. It could also be massively helpful in helping us address our most serious problems like poverty, like agriculture, like climate change. We think then that by far the most important thing in this debate is the regulatory mechanism. That is, how do we generate any sort of response to artificial intelligence? How do we make artificial intelligence work for us? So our extension is going to answer that. Okay, so the first thing that I want to note is that we don't currently have strategy to control or regulate AI. That is to say that humans have been trying really, really hard, and the select number of people who are working in the AI regulatory field, people like Nick Bostrom, the Ada Lovelace Institute, et cetera, the people that I've been working with over the past semester are working really hard, but don't quite have the ideas right now that would be able to stop artificial intelligence. The reason why, if it is much, much smarter than us, then it is better at playing logic games than us, then it is much more able to beat us in whatever game it does create. So if strong AI is created, we currently don't have a way to actually control it. It would be like, trying to trick a baby is to that as what we are doing when we are trying to trick a baby when it tries to trick us. Ultimately, what that means then is that we actually don't really have a good way to deal with this. Even if we try to pull the plug, there's no telling whether it has been able to connect to the airwaves, whether it's been able to spread to other places. Strong AI then currently cannot be contained. We need to devise strategies to contain them. I think that this has huge implications under our side of the house. But the point is that AI can better help us develop ideas to contain other AI. I want to know, I don't want to hear any like dumb Luddite arguments about how this AI won't want to generate ideas because it could be used to control itself. An AI that is used specifically for language processing and language generation is not the same as an artificial general AI that would be controlled through this. And it also would be a distinct AI that would not care about this other AI. So this could be used for this purpose. But what this gives us is two things. Firstly, tons and tons and tons of ideas that we can read and assess for ourselves. Yes, maybe it is the case that you might believe this AI doesn't have the purest of intentions, but humans themselves can read for what exactly the AI is doing. And it's going to be a hell of a lot better and many more in number than what humans have in terms of ideas. But the second thing to note is that AI has the greater ability to play through many different logical and game theoretical scenarios than any average human mind can. And therefore, it can think through what the other AI might be able to do, and therefore what humans can do in response to it. So this devises strategies that is crucial. But the second thing that I want to note is that we need to create a massive public will in support for regulating AI and using AI for the good side. I want to note, opening does say some things that are related to this. We give them credit for that. They say, you'll have a Guardian article, you'll be able to read it, you'll be shocked, you'll see progress. People are already skeptical, but they miss out on what is actually needed to create control. What will identify as needed? The first thing is that I want to note that the average person thinks of AI right now as really, really stupid. So even if they're skeptical of tech companies, they don't think that AI are actually capable of doing much. Yeah, they might have heard of AlphaGo at some point, but they think that that's rather targeted. And the vast majority of the AI that they hear about is like, oh, well, a robot can't tell whether a squiggly letter in the CAPTCHA is an L or an I, or like the video game AI that their kids play against. They think that most AI is pretty bad, and therefore AI isn't that good. The closest thing that they might have is voice assistants, which are generally quite bad at their job because phones are not equipped with top-level technology. As a result, then, we firstly need to prove that the public doesn't think that AI is very good before proving that this creates concern. The public currently doesn't think that AI is very good. The next thing that I'll prove is that this creates concern. The second argument that I'll make is that the journalistic and writing industry will care a whole lot about this, and this is crucial, right? When all the journalists and writers in the world begin fearing for their lives because they're an industry that is most strongly affected by this specific form of AI, they all start pumping out tons and tons and tons of articles to scaremonger and fearmonger people away from AI. The industry speaks on this. Individual writers and bloggers speak about this. And note, these are the people who would be able to educate the public about this sorts of stuff, able to put out explainers, infographics, videos, talk about it on talk shows. And note, the public generally doesn't know anything about AI, how to regulate AI, or what kind of risk AI poses. They need average people who are very good at communicating with the public to be able to communicate this to them, rather than university professors trying to communicate it to them. We are much more able to get that under our side of the house because, again, the journalism industry and the writing industry have a vested stake in trying to control AI now and turn the public against AI. That's something that we're much more likely to get under our side of the house. Happy to take a closing POI, by the way.
Yeah, so what do you think is more likely, that our robot overlords end up controlling us, or that China continues to commit a genocide in Xinjiang?
I don't see how these two things are related. Feel free to run the extension. Okay, the next thing, the thing to talk about here is that when journalists are involved in this, they won't let this fall out of the media cycle. The huge problem right now isn't that people aren't scared of things happening. Sure, people are scared of things happening. People don't like Amazon when they hear that they don't pay their taxes, or they don't like Facebook when they hear about Cambridge Analytica, but that all fades after like 2 weeks. When journalists refuse to let this fall out of the news cycle, when they continually bombard people with this news, this generates the political will to regulate big tech. Right now, it's once every few months we hear about it. Now there is consistent pressure that's consistently applied and therefore forces politicians to act on it. But third thing, politicians themselves will be scared of the persuasive abilities of the AI because tech companies will have a better grip over the public than they will, which is the worst fear of a politician. Therefore, they're more likely to regulate it as well. But the final thing to note is that people will stop trusting basically anything that tech companies say right now. Right now, these companies can generally try to lobby the public and seem like they're feel-good people, but now people have a strong distrust of what they see as basically 1984-style propaganda that is literally putting words in front of you, meaning that no one will like Google or Facebook anymore, or even trust anything that Google or Facebook says. What are the impacts? We think they're fairly clear. One, huge amounts of public funding for regulators. Regulators are not only needed, but also trusted because they've been consulted over and over again by national media on major news networks on all sides of the political spectrum. We have regulators that will take strong antitrust action, like preventing companies who use this AI from being able to file patents, but also have tech-specific regulators for safeguards. But also, more importantly, more NGOs and independent groups will develop and receive support for their activities, like the Data Justice Lab or the Ada Lovelace Institute. We might fail at regulating, but this is our best chance. That's an existential risk. Very proud to propose.
I'd like to thank the
Three, two, one. First, on the OG use cases and why they're out of the debate. There are 3 responses to the contextualization that OG offers. First, to the extent that what you're worried about is the ability of companies like AstraZeneca to gather and process data to help prevent a pandemic, it is unclear why that has anything to deal with this debate, which is about generating language, not interpreting language in different reports and synthesizing that into data. Second, to the extent that there are already major successes in the ability to do things like the projects they talk about, it is unclear why you require a further rise in more intelligent language generating capabilities in order to get meaningful outcomes. Third, in fact, note that all of their arguments about like skepticism and people being like skeptical of like AI generated content fall out of the round because you have no incentive as a technological company to label language generated by an AI as language generated by an AI. Why is this the case? Because the very argument we hear from the DPM, which is like people are inherently distrustful of computers. If that's the case, then telling people that an article or report that they're reading was written by an AI is going to push them away and decrease your revenue, so you never tell them in the first place. So skepticism abounds because people are unable to distinguish real from fake content. In this speech, relative to OO, I think in their attempt to burn us out, they end up being awfully uncomparative. What we're going to do is actually present to you the positive case for our side. We're going to talk to you about why it is that you get much better consequences on our side and not just a purely mitigatory case that I think OO offers. First, though, in response to CG and this argument about like AI teaching us how to control AI, 3 responses. I'm sure Eva will do some more. First, AI is backwards looking and based on extant data. That means that you have to train the models based on information that is already out there. It is therefore unclear to me why, if we haven't been able to plant the seeds about how to control AI, that AI will suddenly be able to take all that we've written and somehow magically come up with ideas about how to how to defeat AI. Second, it is deeply unclear to me what the ultimate impact is of any of this argumentation. It is unclear to me what the worst thing is that AI can do to us. CG presupposes that we have no idea how to control AI. I think if you're on this in the first place, that is, if we know how to improve the model by that this article is actually just Google trying to take control for the liberal masses. Third, you create broader distrust of technology in society. The fact that these same companies in charge of the AI are the ones that run massive social platforms right now that conservatives view as hostile, as I explained, means that they use it as an excuse to retaliate against Twitter for banning people who spread hate speech and stuff like that. What are the unique comparisons here? First, in the status quo, people have a decent grasp over what's at stake for other issues at tech, things like discrimination more generally. When you change this debate into one about the ability of AI to dictate the information that we consume, you specifically disproportionately empower the populace who are viewed as people who have already been on the leading edge of being worried about technology to take control, and they regulate not just technology platforms, but also they retaliate specifically politically, which deters platforms like Twitter, for example, from cracking down on hate speech that's necessarily associated with populists. I'll take a POI from opening before I move on.
David, I preempted both your and CD's extension 4 speeches ago. If you don't support the trend and get both good and bad actors in the game, the only people who will stay in the game are people, like you said, people with strong, perverse incentives. Doesn't that just compound the harms on your side?
Maybe I misunderstood the POI, but I think this is exactly the point, which is that the rise changes the composition of the political actors who speak out about technology and pushes it disproportionately toward populists because they're the ones who have been viewed on the leading edge of this issue so far. And so people trust that they are the ones who are well positioned to actually crack down on these kinds of abuses. Final thing I want to talk about, though, is journalism, which is typically the greatest check on abusive government. Note that you are likely to fire a lot of journalists. Why? Because there's a strong incentive for news organizations to invest in this kind of language generating technology to bring down their costs. The problem, though, is that when you displace these kinds of journalists, the AI, one, can only write about what has happened in the past because it's not like an entity with the ability to investigate, and second, is unable to investigate novel questions. So you lose the ability of investigative journalists to be a watchdog against governments in the worst case that are abusive, and in the best case that are like relatively benign but still take negative actions that no one's there to actually watch out about. The journalists don't get rehired because you have to make a massive upfront capital investment in the AI technology, meaning that there's no one to check back against the authorities with the greatest ability to actually crack down on this stuff. Those reasons, very proud to oppose.
Also, in case, well, I guess this is probably not my last round ever, but thanks to Matt and to the Yale teams and to everyone else. Very fun round. Okay. All right, starting my speech in 3, 2, 1. What people have missed in this debate is that AI is a very diverse set of technologies, even though they have some similarities. What we have focused in on is not just pointing this out, as our OG says, but actually drawing direct comparisons between two different types of AI and why promoting this type of AI, language generation, uniquely allows us to check actually dangerous AI, which is things called strong AI. I just want to be very clear about what these differences are. Strong AI is a general AI that will always be developed in a black box for 3 reasons. The first reason is that it itself is capable of creating that black box. This AI can control itself, can edit its own code, and can trick human beings into not knowing exactly what it is or what it is doing. It is capable of doing things like generating its own goals, generating its own initiatives, creating own code for itself. This is markedly different from language generating AI, which, while it might be able to create some amount of code, does not have these evolutionary sort of capacities. This is why when David tells you, oh, just unplug the AI, that cannot happen because you will not be able to A, understand the dangers of the AI or what it is doing because it can lie to you, but B, actually understand what exactly this AI is doing because as Matt told you, it could do things like get into like radio waves and things of that nature, which means that it is deeply dangerous. We think that this is the AI that can do things like mess with the energy grid, that can do things like harm massive amounts of human beings because it generates its own goals. What then do we think is the tamer version of the AI that we can promote that can both do some good, but most importantly can generate the regulatory capacity and the regulatory will to ensure that big scary AI never comes out in the first place? This is the language generating AI. 3 direct link chains and why I don't think any of these are touched by what we just heard out of CG. The first is that the average person in the status quo thinks that AI is not a huge threat and does not have a huge interest in regulating it. What we've heard is that, oh, AI is used for small things like algorithms, right? This is CG's case. Well, I love my TikTok algorithm because it feeds me hours of entertaining content daily. Even if this wasn't AI, I wouldn't be particularly afraid of it, right? But what are we afraid of? We are afraid of AI that looks like it can be a human emotion, AI that is writing novels or poetry, AI that is speaking directly to you. Currently, Siri looks pretty silly because you can't answer it a complex question, but when AI talks to you like a human being, this triggers an inherent emotional response from humanity that is deeply fucking scared of this. We think that this means that we can regulate it when it does wacko shit. Note that this sidesteps everything that we heard out of OG, because yes, it is true that some of this can be used positively, but it's also true that it can be used negatively. What does this mean? It means that there's a huge generative press attention towards this AI, which we think builds up the regulatory capacity for it. Okay. I want to go through that link chain and integrate some rebuttal to what we just heard from CG. They say that like tech will have no incentive to label this, so how will you even know if you're reading something that's written by a machine? I think this is false for 3 reasons. One, your own opening told you that scientists are oftentimes cocky assholes who want the world to know that they are very successful. This means that when scientists create an AI that can write a new Russian novel, they want to tell you about it. Secondarily, these are expensive. We think that is actually true coming out of opening opposition, which means that we think that's actually true coming out of opening opposition, which means that you need to have publicity stunts in order to get enough funding to continue working this AI. And third, and most importantly, we just gave you a ton of incentives as to why this will probably be leaked by the press deliberately, because people are desperately scared of it, and it's likely to garner a lot of attention if it turns out that the most popular author of the year is actually a full robot. What do we think that this means? We think that it's not so much that we can turn it off, and it's not so much that tech will never tell us about it. This also contradicts what they told us about why populists are going to take advantage of this doubt in order to like cast out on any news against populists. I think, in fact, the left is far more likely to be speculative of tech. This is partially because everything that we've told you about authoritarian governments manipulating things like propaganda, right? But also things that we've told you about the surveillance state. We just think that the left is far more scared of large governments. I think it's more likely to happen on this side of the house. But even if the right is also scared of it, if it still generates regulatory potential, then it saves everyone in the end. I just don't think that this is offense for their side. Okay. Oh, also, thirdly, populists will always call things fake news. It doesn't matter if they say it's fake news because the scientists are paid off by Israel, or if they say it's fake news because it's written by technology. I don't think that there's an actual delta in populists like discounting public news, right? So given that that is out of the debate, what is in the debate at this point? We've given you a 3-step link chain. Average person is not scared of AI in the status quo. AI is deeply scary and needs to be regulated. And 3, only the proliferation of language AI, because it uniquely puts journalists' jobs at risk, which are the actual actors that need to be deeply engaged, and it makes politicians feel at risk because sorry, I just saw the thing in chat. Okay, and it makes politicians feel at risk because it knows that their propaganda machines are going to be outcompeted by other propaganda machines. Only this way do we get consistent generative attention to regulate AI. Why do we think that this solves the biggest harms in the round? One, before I go on to that, I'll take opening opposition.
And this technology gives massive utility to authoritarian regimes like China and Russia with no democratic accountability. Why would these governments self-regulate?
It's not so much that these governments will self-regulate. Well, okay, several things. One, I think that, it's not so much that these governments will self-regulate, but rather that in the status quo, there's a 0% chance of any kind of regulation because we do not have regulatory capacities at all, i.e. there's no solvency under your side of the house. We give the best access to solvency, even if that isn't automatically deployed. Your own policy just told us that because these are so expensive, countries will do things like refuse to export this technology to other governments. I think that also China just doesn't need AI to oppress Uyghur people. That's probably going to be happening on both sides of the house. The more likely thing is that we're scared of AIs that do truly dangerous things, not under the control of any government, things that strong AI can do. Okay, why are we winning this debate? First, I want to talk about the short diagonal here, just to make this really clean. One thing about the short diagonal is that opening opposition has quite a large contradiction in their case, which they say is first, that AI is incredibly expensive to develop and thus no one will get it. And second, that this is then going to take all of the jobs because every single company will replace all of their actors with AI. Closing also bites into this when they say that the New York Times will replace every single author that they have with these bots. We think this is not true, partially because they cannot do it, right? But most often because it's probably just not profitable to spend this much money on this technology. What do we think is the important thing, though? We think that the important thing is that we sidestep the debate out of opening and we sidestep and occupy all of the impacts coming out of closing, which is that if it is true that AI technology has harmful capacities, we think that this is mostly applicable to strong AI technology. We think that the only way to regulate strong AI technology and other AI technology is to allow exposure of the public by implicating key actors. These key actors are, 1, fear of the public. We think that this is a very important factor, that it only comes out specifically with artistic technology, not just things like ads and not just things like scientific development, but actual art. Secondarily, politicians who are scared of the propagandistic potential of this. And thirdly, and most importantly, journalists who we think are going to direct mass attention into these issues and get these companies get the startups and initiatives that are going to regulate AI, the actual attention, money, and political capital they need to do that regulation. I want to do some impact weighting here. I think that the largest impact in this round potentially is that strong AI goes completely uncontrolled. This triggers absolutely all of the bad impacts that we've heard out of closing side, as well as a ton of other impacts that Matt told you about, disrupting the energy grid, setting off nukes, etc. Any chance that this is incredibly harmful, we think that that chance only is ever undercut by the arguments that CG has given you. For these reasons, I think we win this debate.
Problem with all of GovBench is that language is not just intended to convey information, it is an intrinsically knowledge generative process. They never deal with anything that has to do with critical thought. First point of clash, all of my rebuttal is going to be interwoven, is on the impact on industry itself. First, in for-profit industries with technical writing, we say that this leads to consolidation and monopolization. I think this clashes with the OG analysis on innovation and improvement, in that the structural advantages of AI over human individuals means that as AI rises, it is likely to overtake human beings. To be clear, the OG analysis that this optimizes call centers means that real human beings are getting fired. It is unclear to me why my utilities company having higher profits is more beneficial than real human beings having jobs in a world where low and mid-scale workers have increasing difficulties finding employment and surviving absent any weighing mechanism from OG. Also, if these people get laid off, they're probably more likely to vote for those types of populists that David tells you about. I think that this means that this flows to op because money is a facilitative right to survival versus any, especially in nations with like limited ability to provide social services where labor-intensive sectors traditionally exist. But and OO spends a lot of time on like why only Alphabet can have language AI. However, there are two reasons we just outweigh OO's analysis. First, technical writing is fairly rote and has like the least social utility in comparison with things like journalism that David focuses on. The gain in size of Facebook, which is already a massive company, probably generates relatively small changes in things like the market or regulatory capture, considering how large Facebook and Google are already pre-AI, right? Like 100% monopoly versus 98% monopoly is not super comparative. Second, we explained to you the relative unique areas where humans provide benefit currently and are decimated is places where they engage in critical thinking, asking novel questions, developing new understandings of terminologies rather than backwards looking AI, right? That means that the biggest impact in this round is the ways in which this decimates the journalism industry and increases populism, which is the heart of David's extension, right? What does he tell you? First, on populism, he says that if people indeed fear AI, they are skeptic on all information and facts, which means that they turn to a savior-style strongman who has an incentive to distort facts. There is not a delta that populists are incentivized to attack the news, but you warned on CG that people are more scared of technology, so voters are comparatively more likely to believe these populists. Even if you don't change what the leaders themselves are changing, you change the buy-in you get from voters. Cam misses that comparative. Second, on journalism, we say that newsrooms are already losing money. They have an incentive to invest in this because AI can write a lot of articles fast, and if you write 30 articles, you get a lot of clicks, you get a bigger profit than like the uncertainty of highly variant reception to bombshell pieces by like human investigative journalists. The problem here is that David tells you AIs are structurally incapable of investigative journalism. Why? One, AI can only report on prior news and events. It doesn't have the ability to ask novel questions. Two, like AI can't go places and do investigations like when Shane Bauer became a prison guard and then exposed the Louisiana prison system in Squo, right? In the status quo, you need these types of articles because they get a lot of clicks and they beat out, and even like beat reporters are kind of like slow and to write like on like current events, right? In the new world, the relative speed of fact reporting outpaces and means that if a company has to pay $100,000 to a star journalist or to invest in an AI that can turn out 50 articles that might get less clicks per article, get more like clicks on net, that journalism company makes more net, they fire all their journalists, right? That means that you lose all investigative capacity in the media industry, the ability to be a watchdog on the government. The value of human writers is in like the questions they ask. It's not in the like writing of the sentences, right? When you lose that investigative capacity, you can't be a watchdog. When you have no state accountability, that means the state can act worse because it knows that it goes unchecked, given that it is also more likely that the state state is more has like more populists and therefore has a weaker support for democratic institutions and rule of law that preserve individual rights, you see a net erosion of human rights, net erosion of individual abilities. This is the most important thing in the round because these are facilitative rights that provide a baseline utility rather than the marginal increase in well-being that better tech provides on Gov. Finally, we think that this implicitly clashes with the whippersnappers on CG. One, we say that fear-mongering by journalists only works when they're not fired. Two, by the time people view this as a credible threat, is probably too late to regulate. And three, they just lose because they never delineate the tipping point. If there is a rise now that gives like AI a lot of power and effect, like OG says, so that you're able to like influence vaccines and everything, it is not clear why more of a rise will get you regulation when the AI is already capable and already has extensive powers, without that more of a rise also meaning that you are incapable of regulating it because of things like regulatory capture. Finally, in response to the OG analysis that without more AI, you will get manipulated by Russia and China, I think that this analysis is just uncomparative, right? David says that totally independent of who is in power, you lose the ability to effectively critique the government and you're manipulated on either side, right? In the world of Gov, you are also manipulated into not having the tools to criticize your own government, even if Russia and China and the Internet Research Agency are trying to influence American elections, as I said, on either side. That's the tipping point. That's where we get the larger harms accruing. Okay, I'll take a POI from OG.
What you're missing there is that when you don't support the trend, you crowd out any good actors. Could you also deal with our analysis on how the public is much more likely to understand AI?
I think that the crowding out analysis is the exact analysis I give you on things like the journalism sector, right? If it is the case that AI is so much more like efficient than the traditional sector, then you crowd out all of the actors with noble intentions, right? The problem is that the AI like incentivizes bad actors and it incentivizes uncritical actors, specifically actors that don't have an ability to check back against structures of authority in ways that you only get not when you're just reiterating what like previous words and sentences have said, but when you're asking critical questions, doing investigations and generating new information. All right. Second point of clash then is on the types of language you are likely to use. Right. Okay. So what does open in government say? They say there is a cognitive limitation on big data processing, but like humans have the ability to think critically. What does that mean? We already have the ability to process massive data sets on things like Stata and R and Python. Regression analysis exists on either side of the house. They don't get to fiat that like you just get rid of the ability to do COVID research, right? The difference is now that AI chooses what questions you're asking and the words you're using to explain these results. Also means you don't get any sort of like culturally relevant explanation of like why the COVID vaccine is good, etc. Why is that? Because David tells you at the top of the speech that the language AI works by performing a maximum likelihood analysis on what type of sentence out of millions of different variants are most similar to the extant human written sentences. In other words, this is forward or backwise stepwise like regression, right? What that means is that you converge toward the median and you drop the other sentences that are potential like sentences written until you get something that is the closest facsimile. You never get any type of sentences that is not like strictly within the status quo, that is not sort of the median of what is already the product of human generated knowledge and writing, right? That means you never get any sort of like envelope pushing on their side of the house, right? Second thing OO runs and why we outweigh them is their analysis that algorithms are biased in the justice system. They never explain why language AI is going to be biased beyond repetition. Here's the mechanization David gives you. First, the aforementioned tendence towards the medium, just in terms of the like max MLE. Second, language never evolves on their side of the house when it is always selected based on historic word uses. Comparatively, writers want a claim in our world and they have an incentive to invent like new, spicy, sexy phrases and allow for things that better self-identification. OO says readers don't critically assess AI. CG says that readers fear AI. We break that deadlock by saying regardless of perception, certain ideas just no longer exist in the sphere of information. This is important to the individual. The weighing is even if you communicate technical individual information more slowly and less effectively, the benefit is much smaller than the concrete harm of oppression and not being able to challenge the systems of authority. For all these reasons, proud to oppose.